He was born to save a dynasty, and buried before his voice ever deepened. The boy they waited for the miracle. Son of Henry VIII, did not grow into the warlike monarch his father imagined. Instead, Edward VI became something else, entirely a shadow trapped between the weight of a kingdom and the silence of a grave, too small to hold him. When he died in the summer of the year 1553, the story should have ended there. The crown passed on, the tomb sealed, the body embalmed in rituals and reverence. But that wasn't how this story ended, because his coffin was not just buried, it was cracked, opened, violated, and for centuries, his skeleton lay exposed in the dark. While the rest of the world forgot his name, Edward was only 9 years old when his father, the infamous Henry, finally died. Bloated and festering from years of gluttony and gangrene, the boy was rushed into Westminster Abbey, placed beneath the weight of a golden crown forged by his father's fear of irrelevance. Behind the pageantry was panic, a Protestant child ruling over a divided kingdom, surrounded by wolves dressed in ermine. A regency council took control, and at the helm was his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, a man who wielded royal power like a dagger. The child king had no voice. He was a symbol, a living artifact, marched from one palace to another, while decisions were made in his name and blood was spilled under banners bearing his initials. For a moment, it looked like he might survive it all. In the year 1550, Edward was struck by a mysterious illness fever, coughing, trembling fits, but he recovered. The court held its breath. The boy, they said, was strong, but beneath the thin silk of royal robes, his ribs showed, his eyes grew hollow. He was short-sighted, half-deaf, and relied on spectacles to read the scriptures. He loved more than swords. Still, they paraded him through gardens, propped him up at windows, painted portraits to assure the realm their king was whole. But he wasn't. Not really. By December of the year 1552, the whispers began again. He was coughing, constantly. His sheets were stained red in the morning. His hands trembled when he wrote. His stomach swelled grotesquely while the rest of his body withered. Tuberculosis. The physicians muttered behind gloved hands. Some said it was measles. Others smallpox. A few spoke of poison. A slow-acting venom slipped into wine, orchestrated by a faction that feared what a living Edward might become. One woman, a healer of dubious reputation, was smuggled into his apartments and fed him a potion that made his limbs double in size and nearly stopped his heart. Still, he lingered. On the 15th of February, Mary, his Catholic half-sister, came to see him. He was lying in bed, barely able to lift his head. He smiled at her. They say he coughed blood into a handkerchief after she left. The royal court kept everything secret. Outside, England moved on. Wars were fought. Alliances shifted. Prayers were said while inside Greenwich Palace. The king was dying. In April, they moved him to the gardens, thinking fresh air might help. Witnesses said he walked among the trees, hunched over, one hand on his chest, the other grasping for air. Some swore they saw blood dripping from his mouth into the soil. By June, his body was breaking. His hair fell out in clumps. Ulcers appeared across his legs and stomach. His fingernails turned black. Ambassadors came to visit and left visibly shaken by what they saw, a child drowning in his own lungs. Yet plans were still made. Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, was declared heir in secret documents. The throne was already slipping away from him before he ever had a chance to hold it. On the 1st of July, a crowd outside the palace glimpsed him at a window. His face was sunken. He raised a hand and then vanished behind the curtain forever. He died 5 days later. On the 6th of July, just after sunset, Sir Henry Sidney held him as he whispered, "I am faint, Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." The room fell silent. The physicians moved in. They opened his chest to find lungs riddled with ulcers and rot. The embalming was hurried. His body, already decaying, was wrapped in cerecloth and placed inside a lead coffin. It was meant to last forever. But even in death, Edward was not safe. His funeral was grand. Modelled after his father's, barges floated his body down the Thames. Candles were lit. Choristers wept. Westminster Abbey glowed with ritual and artifice. But beneath the surface, something darker was festering. The white marble vault built for him was too small. It was tucked awkwardly near the tombs of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Founders of the Tudor line, Edward had no grand tomb, no effigy, no monument. The boy who was supposed to carry the dynasty forward was lowered into a space barely longer than his own frail frame, then forgotten. A century later, Bar returned. In the year 1643, during the English Civil War, Puritan soldiers stormed the abbey. They tore down altars, smashed stained glass, ransacked royal graves. Edward's was among them. His coffin, once sealed tight, was found split, corroded, exposed. Centuries of moisture and neglect had buckled the lead. Some say internal gases exploded. Others believe the Puritans cracked it open deliberately. Either way, by the time historians opened it in 1868, they found the cerecloth peeled away, revealing bone. His skull was bare, his coffin dented and misshapen. No repairs were made, no new tomb erected. They left him there again, and so Edward VI remains where he always was, hidden in shadow, denied the dignity of a king. His bones wrapped in the silence of unfinished stone. There is no statue to honour him, only a small stone, placed over his resting place in 1966. Reads plainly, "In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. But no one visits, no one weeps, no flowers are laid. He was born to be the sun that ended the Tudor storms, but he died a pale ghost, and his body opened, exposed, and forgotten, still lies in the dark, waiting for a tomb that was never built. He was just a boy when they placed the crown on his head, and though they said he looked proud in his robes, though the trumpets blasted and the bells rang through the frost-bitten air of January, there was a tremble in his hands. No one wanted to see. A flicker in his wide eyes that betrayed something much older than fear, the ancient knowing that this was not a gift but a sentence. That the crown did not rest on his brow, but pressed into the soft place between childhood and duty, where dreams were still fragile and voices still cracked when reading aloud. Because Edward was not yet 10 when he became king. Not yet a man. Not yet anything finished. And they all knew it. They gave him tutors with soft hands and sharpened tongues. Men who filled his days with Latin prayers and Protestant scripture and the art of war he would never live to wage. And they called him clever, said he had the mind of a philosopher and the faith of a reformer. But still he longed for his mother, who had died in birthing him, and for the shadow of a father he could never outrun. For no matter how upright he sat or how piously he studied, he was never not the son of Henry, the man who had torn apart the church for love and power, the man who had executed 2 queens and hundreds more, the man whose throne was built on blood and whose name echoed through every hallway of every palace Edward would ever walk. They say the boy took well to kingship in the beginning. But kingship did not take well to him. For what is a king with no power? What is a crown? If every decision is made in your name, but without your voice? And what does it mean to rule a country when your uncle holds the sword, and your face is just a seal stamped on parchment by grown men fighting over who gets to rule through you? For that is what Edward became. A proxy. A pawn? A boy behind a curtain drawn by courtiers who smiled and knelt and poisoned each other with whispers and promises. All while Edward wrote his childish journal with trembling fingers. noting the executions like a schoolboy, records the weather. His pen scratching the names of those who had once bowed before him and were now ashes beneath the tower. And yet, the boy tried. He studied theology, not for appearances, but for passion. He corrected his bishops. He wrote treatises on faith, and tried to shape the church in his own image. And though his body was always too thin, his eyes too tired, his breath too shallow, his mind ran ahead like a wild horse, seeking light. And some say he even hoped to outgrow the shadows, to rise one day not just as the son of Henry, but as Edward the Great, reformer and unifier, a king who would heal the wounds his father had carved into the country's soul. But fate, or perhaps history itself, I had other plans. It began as a cough in the winter dry at first, then vet, then crimson. The physicians said it was no more than a chill, perhaps the remains of childhood fevers, still clinging to a boy who had never been strong. But the cough did not leave, and with it came dreams of falling, of drowning, of choking on air. And the boy who once debated scholars with sharp words now struggled to whisper through the nights, his sheets damp with sweat and blood, his servants silent in their sorrow. For what could they say to a king who was still afraid of thunder? By spring, the rumours had reached the markets and the churches, whispers that the king was ill, that his face had grown pale and his eyes too bright, that his bones showed through the silk of his tunics. And though the council tried to hide it, though portraits were painted with careful lies, those who had seen Edward in the gardens knew this was not a recovery. This was not a boy growing into manhood. This was a slow erasure. And behind every wall of every palace, people were already asking who would rule next. Still, Edward walked when he could. They would lead him through the rose paths of Hampton Court, or down the shaded lanes of Greenwich. And though he moved like a reed bending in wind, he would smile at the flowers and whisper Latin verses to himself, as if the air around him could be calmed by words alone. And perhaps it could, for there was something holy in his gentleness, something almost not of this world. And the maid said he was the kind of boy who thanked you every time you poured him water, who never forgot a birthday, who prayed for his enemies. But a crown cannot be borne by gentleness alone. By the early summer, his nails had turned grey, his skin erupted in sores, and he could no longer stand without help. They filled him with potions, wrapped him in cloth, soaked in oil and prayer. But nothing slowed the wasting, and every morning brought more pain, more silence, more pages torn from the book of his life. He would lie in bed and trace the cracks on the ceiling with his eyes, counting them like stars. And when no one watched, he cried not from fear, but from the loneliness of being a king in a body that had betrayed him before he ever truly ruled. And yet they still wrote laws in his name. They still planned marriages and alliances, still debated what should happen when the king was gone, even as he lay only rooms away, his voice no longer able to call for water, his throat raw from coughing, his dreams haunted by the sound of bells not yet rung. In the end, when the pain grew too much, they say he stopped speaking altogether. He simply looked at people, his eyes wide and deep and unblinking, as though trying to memorize every face, every hand, every shadow that passed across his chamber. And on the final day, though that day is not yet ours to speak, he would whisper only once more. But for now, the boy still breathes. Barely, and the crown still rests on his skull like a stone. It began not with thunder, nor prophecy, nor any grand spectacle worthy of a boy king's tragedy, but with a cough that echoed too harshly against the velvet curtains of Greenwich Palace, a dry, persistent sound that clung to the stone corridors like a ghost no one dared name. At first, the court dismissed it, a seasonal chill. They said, perhaps the boy had walked too long in the gardens, or sat near a draught during morning prayer. or overread his books by candlelight. But the truth was far less poetic and infinitely more cruel. It was not the chill of winter that had crept into his lungs, but the rot of something deeper, something that had waited patiently inside him since birth. As if even his body had never truly believed he would grow old. The palace doctors came and went like shadows, whispering diagnosis in Latin, bleeding him by firelight, feeding him bitter tonics meant to purge the body and strengthen the spirit. But the cough only worsened. It rattled his frame. It bent him in half. It filled his sleeves with blood. He could no longer hide. And soon the linens were changed twice daily. Then 3 times. Until the servants no longer looked surprised when the boy king's handkerchiefs came away, stained and soaked. He began to wake in the night, gasping, his chest convulsing as though trying to escape the very crown he had inherited. And sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn he would scream, not from pain, but from the suffocating silence that followed it. The unbearable stillness that hung in the air, when the coughing stopped and all that remained was the sound of his own shallow breath. The walls of Greenwich began to change. Doors were kept open longer. Fires were lit hotter. Courtiers walked more slowly, as though afraid the sound of their heels might disturb the fragile thread keeping their king tethered to the world. Musicians played softer. Prayers were said louder. The physicians prescribed rest. But rest gave no peace. Every morning the boy awoke thinner, bully, more distant, his eyes searching the windows for something none of them could see. Not the sky, not salvation, but perhaps his own fading place within the world he was meant to command. His voice cracked and then disappeared altogether. He stopped speaking, not out of rebellion, but exhaustion. Every word cost him more than it gave. And so he chose silence, letting others talk over him, about him, around him, while he lay beneath the golden canopy that still declared him king. And then came the woman. She was not nobility. She was not trained in any formal art of medicine. She came from the edge of London, from alleys where smoke rose from cauldrons and secrets passed hands faster than coins. They called her a healer, though some whispered the word witch beneath their breath. And it was desperation, not science, that let her into the king's chamber. His uncle allowed it. His physicians tolerated it. And Edward, too tired to object, watched as she prepared a potion thick and dark, brewed from roots and oils and prayers, said in tongues unfamiliar to the marble halls of Tudor power. She touched his forehead with strange symbols, placed drops beneath his tongue, and for a few hours there was calm. Then came the swelling. His limbs doubled in size. His skin turned a deep, angry red. His joints throbbed like drums. He moaned, not from pain alone, but from the horror of becoming monstrous within his own skin, of seeing his hands become claws, his knees too heavy to bend. The potion was meant to cleanse him, but instead it nearly killed him. The woman was removed. Silently, permanently. No one speaks of what happened to her. Perhaps she returned to her alley. Perhaps she never left the palace grounds. But the damage was done. The king had been broken further by the only act of hope they had not already exhausted. The coughing returned with vengeance. He could no longer sit up without help. His legs withered beneath the weight of his frame. His back arched in strange, unnatural ways. His hair began to fall out first in strands, then in clumps, until his scalp gleamed beneath the golden crown they still kept beside his bed. The mirrors were removed. Curtains were drawn. Only a handful of servants remained, those whose loyalty ran deeper than fear, and even they struggled to meet his eyes now. Not because of the illness, but because of what it revealed. Not a king dying, but a child unraveling before them, stripped of illusion and glory, reduced to breath and bone. Yet in the middle of this slow collapse, foreign ambassadors arrived. It was the 17th of May, and they had come to see the boy king as part of a diplomatic formality. They expected ceremony, perhaps a polite smile. A wave. What they found was a wraith wrapped in silks, too weak to speak, his face sunken, his limbs stiff, his breath shallow and uneven. He could not stand. He could barely nod. And when they left, they did not speak of treaties or alliances. They spoke of a nation on the brink, of a monarchy, trembling beneath the weight of a crown held by fingers too fragile to lift it anymore. After that, the doctors stopped pretending. They gave him sleeping draughts and whispered comforts. They began to prepare the nation for what could not be delayed. But the king did not die quickly. He lingered, as though caught between two worlds too broken to recover, too young to surrender. On some days, he would smile faintly when someone read to him. On others, he would weep silently as the sun set behind the palace walls. Once, he asked for music. Another time, he requested to see the gardens. Though he never rose from bed, he was already fading. A little more each day. Not dramatically, but gently, like ink dissolving in water. Impossible to hold. And all the while, the cough remained. It was no longer loud. It no longer tore through his lungs like a sword. It had become something else. A rhythm. A metronome counting down the final days of a kingdom ruled by a boy who could not rule his own body. Those who heard it would carry that sound forever. They would say later that it echoed in their dreams, that they could not stand the sound of winter winds or rustling pages, because all they heard was that cough dry, ragged, royal. And then, one morning, it stopped. But that is not this chapter. This chapter ends not in death, but in the breath before it. The final, trembling silence that fell across the palace when they realized the crown had never rested gently. It had always been too heavy, and no boy, no matter how pious or brilliant or brave, could ever carry a kingdom without breaking beneath it. The garden had once been his favorite place, not for its grandeur or its royal design, but for its quiet, a silence that did not weigh like the throne room's silence, a quiet that did not demand answers, only presence. When he was younger and less hollowed by sickness, Edward had walked those gravel paths with the cautious joy of a child trying to memorize peace. He would pause by the rose bushes, not to smell them but to count the thorns, his eyes lingering on the petals that bloomed too soon and died too fast. In the orchard, he would lift fallen apples and inspect them for bruises, asking his tutor if decay always began at the core, or if it sometimes started in the skin. There was a softness to his steps then, a gentle way, his small feet pressed into the soil, as though even the earth beneath him was too sacred to disturb. But now the garden had changed. Or perhaps it was he who had become unrecognizable beneath the sky that had once comforted him. By early summer, the coughing had not only ravaged his lungs but had taken something more essential, his ability to pretend. The heavy curtains of Greenwich had closed around his sick room, thick with incense and low chanting from clergymen who never looked him in the eye. But even they knew what was coming. Everyone did. The walls themselves had grown tired of hiding it. And so, in a final attempt to lift the veil of dread that hung over the palace like mildew, they decided to take him out into the air, into the only place left that did not yet smell like death. He was carried to the garden in the arms of two attendants, whose faces were as pale as the linen that covered the chair they used to bear his weight. His frame, once that of a slender boy, was now gaunt and sharp, every bone visible beneath flesh that had grown thin and brittle. His hair, once fair and carefully combed, was now patchy, falling away with every shift of the breeze, and his mouth hung slightly open, as though in constant disbelief at the pain of being alive. The sun that day was warm but not harsh. A breeze moved gently through the trees. Birds called, but not too loudly, and for a moment, those who watched him believed or tried to believe that this outing was not his last. They arranged him beneath a willow tree, its branches swaying like hands offering benediction. And they stepped back, giving him the illusion of solitude. Though not one of them dared turn away, he sat still for a long time. No words. No nod. Only breathing thin. Shallow. More like sighs than life. He looked not at the sky, nor the flowers, nor the marble statues that flanked the hedge-lined corridors, but at the dirt. He stared at the soil with such focus that one might think he was trying to will something from it, a resurrection. Perhaps, or simply a reason. At one point, he reached down, slowly, painfully, and touched a patch of moss. His fingers trembled against it, and when he withdrew his hand, there was blood on his fingertips. It had come again. The coughing, silent until now, returned without warning. It seized his body like a wave breaking against a crumbling wall. He bent forward, retching, gasping, his spine curving like a question mark. His attendants rushed to steady him, but he motioned weakly for them to stay back. He did not want hands on him anymore. He did not want comfort that could not heal. He pressed a kerchief to his lips, but it was no use. The cloth soaked quickly red. Then darker still. He dropped it without looking. It landed in the grass beside a pale flower that would not bloom again that season. And then came the sound no one could forget. A single, wet exhale followed by a silence too thick to be called peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that made even the birds stop singing. He looked up, finally, not at the garden, but at the faces around him. There were tears in their eyes. Not many. Not yet, but enough. One of them whispered his name. Not your Majesty. Not sire. Just Edward. And for the first time in weeks, he smiled. It did not last. He leaned back against the chair, too weak to hold himself up. His breathing was ragged now, uneven, like a candle trying to stay lit in wind. The blood had not stopped. A fresh stain was spreading across the front of his robe, and the scent of it thick, metallic, real overpowered the lavender they had dabbed behind his ears before bringing him out. The garden was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage, and death, having rehearsed for weeks, was now making its entrance. Still, they did not carry him back inside. Perhaps they were afraid to move him. Perhaps he asked them not to. Or perhaps they simply hoped, in some quiet place within themselves, that nature could do what science and prayer could not hold him a little longer. So they waited with him beneath the trees, watching as the light changed, as the day folded into shadow, as the boy who had once been England's promise became little more than breath and blood and silence. And in that silence, he spoke again. Only once. He said, "Is this where the kings go to vanish?" No one answered. And he did not ask again. The room was darker now. Not because the candles had burned low, or because the windows had been shuttered, though both were true, but because the light itself had begun to leave him, withdrawing slowly from his eyes, from his fingers, from the hollow of his chest, where breath used to rise and fall with the rhythm of hope. They had moved him from the garden after the bleeding grew too fierce, after the cloth could no longer hold back the stains. And now he lay beneath the heavy canopy bed where kings before him had whispered their final words, and where he would do the same. Though no one yet dared believe that time had come, the bed was too large for his frame, carved with lions and roses, symbols of strength he had never been allowed to feel in his own bones. And though the mattress was padded and perfumed and draped in silk, there was no comfort in it. Not for a child who had spent the last year learning how every corner of that mattress could become a battlefield, a prison, a pulpit from which he could deliver nothing but silence. The sheets were cool, the pillows were soft, but Edward could no longer tell the difference. His world had shrunk to the size of his own breath, and even that was fading. His attendants came in shifts now, walking on the edges of the room like ghosts, afraid to disturb a tomb. They wiped his forehead with damp cloths. They whispered verses beside him. They straightened the covers, though he no longer moved. Once, a page boy with trembling hands offered him a sip of wine. But Edward turned his face away before the cup reached his lips, and the boy left the room in tears. Not because he had failed, but because he had seen the truth. The king was no longer drinking, no longer eating, no longer looking. The fever rose again on the 1st of July. His skin burned against the linen, his body trembling even in sleep. And when he opened his eyes, they flickered as if fighting the memory of who he was. They say he saw things, then his mother, whom he had never known, standing at the foot of the bed. His father, sitting in the corner with the weight of 1,000 regrets in his lap. Angels, perhaps, or just the fluttering shadows of candlelight. He spoke once in Latin, a phrase from Scripture. He spoke again in English, asking for no one in particular. And then, for many hours, he said nothing at all. Outside, the palace kept moving. Documents were signed. Letters were sent. Guards stood post. But everyone knew the truth. The reign had already ended. Even if the death had not yet arrived, his cousin Jane had been summoned. Quietly, the crown, as always, was already looking for its next head. But Edward did not speak of her. He did not ask for Mary or Elizabeth. He did not mention his council or his God or even his kingdom. In the final hours, he asked only one question. He whispered it just before nightfall on the 6th of July, when the air was thick with incense and the heat of too many prayers. His voice was barely audible, more breath than sound. But those who were present, Sir Henry Sidney among them, leaned close enough to hear it clearly. "I am faint," he said, his lips barely moving. "Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." Then he closed his eyes. There was no sudden stillness, no final gasp, no dramatic collapse. He simply stopped. His chest, which had lifted and strained for so many weeks, settled like a tide returning to the sea. His hands, once curled against the pane, fell open. His mouth softened, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as if he were sleeping, as if he might wake again, turn his head, and ask for a book, or a hymn, or a walk in the garden. But he didn't. He never would. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the kind of silence that expands, that grows heavy, that presses against the walls and floors, and the hearts of those who remain. The room felt smaller. The candles flickered. One of the physicians stepped forward and placed a hand gently over the boy's chest. But the gesture was not to feel for breath. It was to accept that there was none left to find. The king was dead. They covered his face with a cloth. They closed the curtains around the bed, and outside, the news began to move, not with shouts or trumpets, but with footsteps, with glances, with the heavy exhale of a nation that had watched a child bear the weight of an empire and then disappear beneath it. In the courtyard, servants stood still. In the chapel, the bells remained quiet. There would be no immediate announcement, no proclamation in the streets, only the hush that falls when something sacred is lost, not because it was great, but because it was never given the chance to become so. Later that evening, his body was prepared. They opened his chest to confirm what everyone already knew. The lungs were blackened and full of ulcers. The blood had pooled where it should not have. The organs had begun to fail long before his final words were spoken. He had been dying for months, perhaps longer. They embalmed him quickly, afraid of what the heat might do to a boy already breaking from within. The cloth they wrapped him in was white and stiff. His hands were folded. His eyes were closed. But someone said they still looked worried, even in death. And then they sealed him in lead. A coffin, they said, fit for a king. But the truth was, No coffin would ever be strong enough to hold what had happened here, not just the death of a monarch, but the fading of a light that had barely flickered to life. They placed the coffin in a chamber of waiting. No tomb yet, no monument, just the lead shell and the silence. And so the deathbed emptied, the air cleared, the servants left. The curtains were drawn once more, and the boy who had once ruled England with parchment and prayer now lay beneath layers of cloth and metal, still and small, surrounded by the last warmth he would ever know. They said it was beautiful. The kind of beauty that chokes the throat rather than softens it. The kind that burns incense, not for peace, but for silence. For disguise. For the delicate art of transforming death into something sacred. Edward had died in July. And yet when they carried him through London, the city saw not a corpse, but a procession that looked more like a crowning than a burial. As if the child who never truly reigned would at least in death be wrapped in the illusion of triumph. The barge that bore him moved slowly along the Thames, its sides draped in deep black cloth, its prow adorned with the royal standard, fluttering limp in the still summer air, and within its belly, resting in a leaden box sealed against time and memory, was the boy they had once called His Majesty, now silent forever. The people lined the riverbanks in silence. No cries, no weeping loud enough to carry, just faces watching. Unreadable. Stunned by the contradiction, the gold of the banners, the scarlet of the velvet, the white plumes on the horses, and beneath it all, the single truth, no one dared speak aloud, that they were burying a child. Not a general, not a warrior, not even a man. A child, broken and blooded by disease, smothered by expectation, and sent into the soil by those who had once called themselves his protectors. And yet no one turned away. They watched the barge float past like a myth come alive, the river catching its reflection like a mirror, trying to remember how to hold grief. At Whitehall, the coffin was lifted by 12 gentlemen in black, their gloves immaculate, their shoulders squared. They carried him through the gates not as mourners, but as if performing a ritual, one that had to be perfect, precise, magnificent. There was no room for tremor, no place for real sorrow. The court had planned every detail with the same care, one reserves for coronations or weddings, because that is what this funeral was meant to replace, a life that would never see either. They took him by torchlight through the abbey cloisters, past the carved saints, whose stone faces had outlived a dozen kings. And as they passed, the candles flickered as if the very walls were holding their breath. Westminster Abbey had seen many deaths, many crowns lowered into vaults, but this one felt different. There were no memories of Edward walking those halls as a man, no victories carved into tapestries, no battles survived. He had given the realm no heirs. He had passed no laws that endured. And yet here they came, with music and pageantry, with robes and mitres, with choirs and censers, to bury him like a king of old. They placed his coffin before the altar, not just any altar, but the one crafted for his grandfather, Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor line, the man who had turned blood into dynasty, who had claimed a crown from a battlefield and forged it into legacy. Edward's coffin, small, even in death, was dwarfed by the marble around it, its lid warped slightly from the swelling of gases, though no one dared speak of that now. The sear cloth wrapped around his body had already failed. But they said nothing of it. They lit candles instead. Hundreds, tall ones that cast warm halos into the vaulted shadows. And in the glow of that light, the boy began to disappear into ritual. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood beside the coffin, his voice clear, but almost too controlled, as if the scriptures themselves were being recited not for the king's soul, but for the court's memory. He spoke of peace, of salvation, of divine inheritance. He called Edward a prince of reform, a son of righteousness, a light extinguished too soon. But what he did not say, what none of them could say, was that the boy had suffered, alone and unheard, that he had been made a vessel for a nation's struggle, and when the vessel cracked, they had rushed to fill it with ceremony. There were trumpets. There were banners lowered in synchronized grief. There were nobles dressed in mourning black, with collars so stiff they could not bow their heads without pain. And still, the coffin did not move. They said prayers over it for hours. When at last they carried him down into the vault, they moved slowly, carefully, not because they feared dropping him, but because the descent into the crypt was the final act, the last image they would ever have of him, and it had to be perfect. The marble vault had been prepared, though it was small, tucked into a quiet space near his grandparents, as if even in death, he was still only adjacent to power. They lowered him into it while the choir sang, and the air grew heavy with smoke and echoes. Then the lid was closed. No fanfare, no final proclamation, just stone. He was gone. The crowd filed out without speaking. Only the candles remained, burning down to their ends, casting slow-moving shadows on the walls, and when the last flame guttered, when the scent of wax faded, Westminster returned to silence, to the same cold quiet that had met every monarch before and would greet every monarch after. But outside, the city did not move on. For days, people left flowers at the abbey gates. Though not in abundance, they spoke his name in hushed tones. Some wondered what might have been had he lived, what kind of king he would have become, what wars he would have fought, what sermons he would have written. Others did not wonder at all. They believed, deep down, that he had never truly belonged to the world he had been born into, that he had always been half a part, a child of parchment and prayer, more idea than flesh, more symbol than soul. And still others, those who knew, those who had seen the blood in the garden, who had carried the kerchiefs, who had bent to catch his final words, they remembered not the coronation, not the funeral, but the boy, and they knew this was not how it should have ended. But they had built it quickly, not for lack of care, but for lack of time, because the summer heat was rising, and the embalmed body of the boy was already beginning to speak in the language that all corpses eventually remember, the scent of things no longer living. The subtle expansion of what has been sealed too long, the cracking of still soft lead beneath the weight of what it was never meant to contain. The vault was not carved in advance, as it might have been for a king expected to die. It was not adorned with golden Latin, nor lined with royal symbols, nor made wide enough to host future generations, because Edward was not supposed to die. Not yet. Not ever. Really. He was the continuation, the son of a legend, the thin thread that would pull the Tudors into a future beyond fire and blood. And yet, here they were lowering his coffin into a vault smaller than a chambermaid's room. It lay beneath the floor of Westminster Abbey, tucked near the steps of the high altar, adjacent to the massive tomb of his grandfather and grandmother Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, who had founded the Tudor line with ambition sharpened by war. Their marble effigies lay stretched in eternal sleep atop a sarcophagus of grand proportions, gilded, painted, measured for eternity. But Edward had no effigy, no statue, no slab of alabaster shaped to resemble his still young face. Instead, the opening that received his coffin was narrow, barely long enough to fit the warped lead casket, and when the bearers placed it down, the walls of the vault shuddered not from grandeur, but from the awkward closeness of stone pressing against metal. There was no room for banners, no space for relics or offerings, only the coffin, and the air, and the dark. The marble that sealed him shut was clean, plain, impersonal, as though carved not for a monarch, but for a placeholder, something temporary, something quiet. And though the choir still sang, And though the bishop still read, and though the flames from the torches still danced across the abbey's high ceiling, those who stood closest to the vault could feel it, the strange, unbearable smallness of it all. The contradiction between the title, His Majesty the King of England and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, and the damp, confining cell now meant to contain his eternity. Some whispered that he should have been buried beside his father in Windsor, near the tomb that had been built with stone and rage and legacy. But there had been no time, no plan drawn, no sarcophagus carved. Others said a new tomb would rise in time, one worthy of him, one that would lift his name among the angels. But years would pass, and nothing would be built, no mason summoned, no artists commissioned. The space remained, as it was a modest vault in a borrowed corner, sealed without fanfare, without promise, without return. Time moved on. Dust settled on the marble. The abbey echoed with newer deaths. Lauder Reins, Blue Dieu Legacy. And Edward, who had once been the future of England, became little more than a line in a ledger, a name in a prayer, a faint engraving in a stone worn smooth by the shoes of pilgrims and choir boys who walked above his bones, never knowing the story of the child beneath them. Generations came and went. Mary reigned, and then died. Elizabeth reigned, and never mentioned him. The dynasty shifted, fractured, reassembled. Wars were fought. Empires were claimed. Kings were crowned and entombed in vaults larger than his entire reign. But Edward remained where he was, silent, untouched, unremembered, until even the altar above him could no longer stand. In the 17th century, when the winds of civil war swept through England like a storm that no abbey could withstand, Puritan soldiers entered Westminster, not as mourners or pilgrims, but as destroyers. They shattered icons. They stripped gold from chapels. They saw not holy ground, but royal propaganda. And so they smashed the altar that had once crowned Edward's resting place, the only marker above his head, the only shelter from the forgetting. And when they did, they may have broken more than just marble. Some believe they opened the vault. Some say they desecrated the coffin. Some whisper that the damage done in those days would never be repaired. But no one speaks of it too loudly. Even now, even century later, no one dares say exactly what they found when they looked again. Because when the vault was finally opened in the year 1868, not by soldiers, but by historians and clergymen, what they found was not peace. The coffin had cracked. The lead had deformed. The cerecloth had decayed and fallen away from the face. And through the split, they saw it. The remains of a king who had never been crowned in memory, whose bones now lay exposed. Skeletal, fragile, unpreserved. There was no hair on the skull, no protection from time, only the slow corrosion of neglect. The whisper of a child's crown still rusting in a tomb, too narrow to hold anything but grief. They resealed it, quietly, no ceremony, no reburial. No new tomb built, just a stone. Decades later, placed discreetly in the floor. Reading, in memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. That was all. Not even his full title. Not even his full story. Because the vault was too small for that. Too small for a king. Too small for a boy. Too small for the truth. It was not meant to be opened again. The lead that sealed him had been folded with the precision of fear, the cloth bound with prayers that no longer carried weight, and the marble above had been laid as though to say, enough. But time does not honour marble, nor does curiosity honour rest. It began in the year when men with books and lanterns crawled beneath the abbey floors. Not to pray, but to study, they sought the truth of kings, the architecture of dynasties, the measure of history buried in dust. And so it was almost by accident that they came upon the vault of the boy who had once been England. They cleared the debris. They brushed the stone clean. And there, behind the altar rebuilt, long after the Puritan wreckage, they found it a small leaden box, misshapen, bent at its corners, no longer sealed as it once had been. They said at first it looked like all the others, plain, heavy, grey, but then the lamplight caught the metal, and they saw it had split. Not a wide break, not an intentional gash, but a rupture that had widened over centuries of silence, a slow yielding of lead to the gases trapped within, or perhaps to the hands of those who had disturbed it before. No record remained of the Puritans opening this place. Yet something had been done. The lid had been forced down crookedly, the edges torn, as though someone had tried to look inside and then, frightened by what they saw, had fled and left it half shut. When the scholars lifted the debris and peered through the crack, they did not speak for some time. They saw, through the jagged seam, the remains of cloth that had once been white, but now clung to the bones like cobweb. The air that escaped was dry, fin, sour with age. Inside, they saw the curve of a skull, the long bones folded wrong within too narrow a box. No hair remained. No trace of the boy's soft features survived. The sear cloth, meant to preserve him, had failed long ago. The skin had liquefied. The flesh evaporated, leaving only the outline of what once had been royalty. The lead, having buckled inward, had pressed against him for hundreds of years, until even the idea of peace had collapsed into dust. One of them, a young man with trembling hands, wrote later that the sight made him cold, not from horror, but from pity. He said the coffin looked not broken by time, but by neglect, as if the centuries had forgotten to remember gently. He closed his lantern then and turned away, for there was something indecent about how clearly the dead boy could still be seen. He said it felt like interrupting a dream. Another recorded that the bones had taken on a faint sheen, the residue of lead and moisture blending into a dull, ghostly patina that shimmered when the light shifted. It was beautiful, he wrote, but not in a way that any living thing should be. They argued what to do. Some said the coffin should be repaired, resealed, given a new casing of dignity. Others said to leave it, that to touch it again would be to admit how carelessly it had been forgotten. In the end, they did nothing. They placed the broken panels back as best they could, replaced the marble above, and recorded the measurements in a ledger that few would ever read. The boy king was left as they had found him, exposed yet hidden, remembered yet unhealed. And so the legend began. They said the rupture had been caused by gas, that the embalming had been rushed, that the mixture of herbs and oils inside the coffin had fermented and expanded, splitting the metal from within. Others insisted it had been vandalized, that during the wars of religion, soldiers had pried it open seeking treasure, mistaking the plain lead box for something that might contain gold. But the truth is quieter, and perhaps crueler. The coffin had simply aged, the lead softening, the seams widening, the air and time doing what air and time always do. The decay was not an act of violence. It was neglect. Yet there is something almost deliberate about the way the story survives, because though no monument was ever built for Edward, though no crown was laid upon his tomb, though no statue of his likeness guards the spot, the image of that cracked coffin, that glimpse of white bone beneath the lead, has become its own kind of memorial. It is not the monument his dynasty would have chosen, but it is honest. It shows what history does when left alone. The abbey has changed since then. The walls have been cleaned. The air no longer smells of candle smoke, but of tourists and polished stone. People walk above him every day, tracing the names of monarchs carved in marble, pausing at the grand tombs, never noticing the small plaque near the floor that bears his name. In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. That is all. Nothing of the boy. Nothing of the pain. Nothing of the crack. just words and years. But sometimes, when the choir sings and the evening light falls through the stained glass, a shadow crosses the stone where his vault lies hidden, and the caretakers say that the air there feels different, colder, perhaps, or thicker, or simply aware, as if beneath the marble, something remembers, not restlessly, not angrily, but with the faint sadness of a life that never became what it was meant to be. And in that darkness, the coffin still waits not for discovery, not for repair, but for understanding. Its split edges gleam faintly in the half-light that filters down through the abbey floor. And though the centuries move on without pause, the crack remains, wide enough to whisper through, wide enough to remind whoever listens that no matter how tightly a dynasty tries to seal its dead, time will always find a way in.